Good morning. Everyone hanging in there? Everyone looks tired today. That might be me projecting because I'm tired too, right? It feels like it's been a long 2 weeks. I keep thinking we have Monday off, but it's the following Monday. So it's coming. We get like a holiday. Not for a little bit. I had another thought. We're back to hot weather. Not my favorite. I wish it would rain again, right? Not a hurricane or earthquake or anything, but just a little rain. Hopefully it's coming. But we'll start chapter 2 today, right? So we finished chapter 1, looking at places around the world, attitudes around sexuality. We're going to look at some sex researchers today, some of the big researchers in the field, focusing a lot on Kinsey. We're going to watch, I think it's like 20-something minutes of a documentary just to get a little bit about him. And then we're going to be working on a little bit of our own sex research toward the end of the day today. So something to look forward to or dread appropriately. But we'll talk a little bit about some of these different theories and researchers and some problems and issues and so on. So when we are in the field of psychology, we have theories for everything, right? Psychology is all about theories. If you take any intro level psych class, you're going to go over all the different models, all the different theories. It feels like that's the topic of the day for me in just about every class today, looking at different theories or models. So when we're in sexuality, we're looking at theories related to human sexuality, right? And there are a bunch of them, and they're covered really well in your book, starting on page 28. So I'm not going to go into these theories. I'd rather spend some time in other places, but I would definitely like you to look them over. So this is theories, sexuality. But these different theories, what they do is they're sets of assumptions or principles or methods that help us to understand whatever it is that we're studying. So in our case, we're studying human sexuality, right? So we have these kind of intellectual structures or frameworks that we can look at a phenomenon through, right? So let's say we're looking at mental illness. We could take these models and talk about how they might shape mental illness or how they might shape human sexuality or personality. We can use them for a lot of different things, but they provide this structure. And what's interesting about these theories is they are just theories, right? We don't necessarily know the answer. So they often overlap with each other, and they might even say the opposite thing, right? So for example, like if you have a theory that talks about behavioral contributions, it's going to talk about how did we learn our sexuality, versus more of a biological one is going to say that we didn't learn anything. It was all in place when we were born. So they oftentimes say very, very different things and approach a phenomenon in different ways. And again, I would love for you to look over these a little bit more. I will definitely ask you about them on the first exam. You'll have a study guide, but definitely read over them a little bit in the book so we can spend time elsewhere. But these different theories are really important for trying to understand a phenomenon. In this case, again, sexuality. And typically, if you ever want to sound brilliant in psychology, you just say it was a combination of everything that led to like X, right? And you're almost always right. So it's probably a combination of every single theory that contributes to who you are and why you are the way you are. So just something to keep in your back pocket. If you ever want to sound right or be right in psychology, say it's a combination of everything. It's totally true. Right, so look over those a little bit. Again, not so much the focus of what we're covering, but definitely something I might ask you about on that first exam. And they start on page 28 in the text. What I want to focus more on are the people who have contributed to what we know about sexuality and a little bit about how we actually conduct some of this type of research. A sexologist is a person who studies sexuality professionally. Right? Can you imagine telling your parents, what do you want to be when you grow up? Sexologist, right? Not a very popular profession, but it's definitely needed. We need people who are studying sexuality, finding out more, understanding this, right? Because this is something that we still don't know a lot about. There are so many things in psychology that we actually don't know a lot about. And if we go back, like sexuality research really started to take off back in like the 19th century. Right? Before that, we didn't really know much of anything. We didn't do any kind of formalized research. In the 19th century, that started to shift a little bit. But when we were studying sex, we weren't studying what was normal and what was common. We were studying bizarre and dangerous and unhealthy aspects of sexuality. That's really what got all of the attention early on. And it was something that was really, for the most part, conducted by doctors and physicians who took a very medical stance when it came to what they were trying to understand. Also very, very problem-driven and fragmented, right? Very scattered. And oftentimes people who were studying sexuality found themselves to be kind of victim of the times, in a sense. It was heavily influenced by politics and the events that were happening. So what you would see is somebody would come out with a journal related to sexuality. Then all of a sudden they would find themselves out of a job or shunned in their professional circles, or even thrown into jail for looking at things that were considered to be obscene or unhealthy or dangerous. So what we see is that as far back as we have documented, this has been very problem driven. And there are some big people who kind of help shift that a little bit, but there's still a lot of room for knowledge and growth here. So if this sounds like a fun area, we need people to study sexuality, right? We need to understand it better. Very, very issue driven, kind of in the early days. And there's a bunch of people who've contributed. It's a lot of like smaller people, and then we'll get to a couple of big ones. So I want to ask you about these folks on this slide, but I do want to mention them, but I won't ask you anything about them like on the exam or anything. But these are some of the kind of very early people who contributed in the field. Now, the first one, Sigmund Freud, probably one of the most famous psychologists. What do you think of when you think of Freud? What do you like? What comes to your mind the second you hear the name Freud? Yeah. Oedipus complex. I love that, right? Oedipus and Electra complex. Yeah. Penis envy. Yeah, for sure, right? He was all about penis envy. Right? Anything else? Anything else you think of with him? Yeah. Okay. Right, the three parts of self, right? The id, ego, and superego. I always think of Freudian slips, right? Like where you say the wrong name or do the wrong thing. Like if you're talking to someone, you say someone else's name, he'd say they were on your mind. Yeah. Yeah, right. Everything is related to the mother. Yeah, right. You're in love with your mother. You hate your father, at least for young girls. Very controversial theories, but he was the first to include a lot of sexuality in his approaches, right? He talked a lot about sex and aggression and something he called libido, right? And we won't really focus on him any more than right here in this class, but he definitely played a big role in contributing and shaping some of our theories around sexuality. Ewan Block is another person here, was the first person to publish a journal related to sexuality. It was called the Journal of Sexology. Magnus Hirschfeld is another one in the early days, founded an institute for sexology. It was the first institute to be founded. You could go there and get advice and talk to other people. It got closed and vandalized multiple times. Again, very difficult time to be studying sexuality. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, one of the most significant medical writers when it came to studying sexuality. He wrote a book called Psychopathia Sexualis, which looks like it would be wildly fascinating to read, right? Just from the covers. Like if I saw that, I'd be like, oh, I'm interested, right? Very boring book, actually. It's so medical. It's so dry and medically driven. But he was one of the first to study this from a very medical standpoint, publishing this book, 200 different case studies of a bunch of individuals with kind of abnormal sexual behavior. Havelock Ellis was another one, right? Havelock Ellis wrote Studies in Sexuality, again, another kind of book that was very medically driven. And then Clelia Mosher, another one of the first women to play a role, also kind of trying to form institutes, writing journals, writing books. All of these people played kind of a smaller role, but they started shaping and paving the way for the people who came later. And the people that really played a huge role are these three here: Kinsey, Masters and Johnson, and Evelyn Hooker. And could you ask for a better sexology researcher name than Evelyn Hooker? Probably could, right? I'm sure that was difficult for her at times. But Kinsey, Masters and Johnson, and Hooker were some of the big researchers early on, especially Alfred Kinsey. And they made a movie about him, it was maybe 10 years ago at this point. Liam Neeson, I think, was who played him. Really great movie if you're interested in knowing more about him. But he's probably one of the most influential sex researchers of the 20th century. He did things that nobody did before him, right? And I'm going to show you, as I said, part of a documentary about him. What's so wild is just the difference of the times. And you'll see this in the video. He was one of the first to teach a human sexuality class. And in order to take this class, you had to be married, right? You had to be married in order to get in, right? People would like move up their marriages and fake marriages in order to take this class. And people were so like uncomfortable. People would faint in these classes when you show pictures of the, you know, parts of anatomy. Just such a different time, right? And so you'll see that a little bit in the documentary. It's kind of just a background on him. He was more of a biologist and an entomologist who got interested in sexuality and the variety that comes in sexuality. So we'll watch that, and then we'll talk about Masters and Johnson and Evelyn Hooker. You don't need to take notes or anything. I think it's just kind of a nice background on him. And again, very, very different time. I would imagine not a single one of you felt like you needed to be married to take this class, right? So again, 50 years later, 60 years later, completely different world. Okay. There's a bunch of ads in the beginning.
Of human sexuality. It is intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit.
I think there's like two more.
At Liberty Mutual Insurance, we do everything we can to help prevent accidents and make America a safer place. Liberty Mutual is proud to support American Experience.
The Scott's Company. We help make gardens beautiful. Lawns greener, trees taller. If there's major funding for this program is provided by UM Hefner, the Ford Foundation, and by the following. American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Summer 1953. The Korean War is ending. Francis Crick and James Watson decode the structure of DNA.
A psychologist, right? Like he didn't have a background necessarily in human sexuality. He was coming at it from a very different take, but he was one of the most influential people, right? He published so many different things and all of this research. Now his research was really flawed, which is the problem. And we'll talk about some problems in sex research in a minute. But one of the things that he didn't do was kind of be random in his sample. He asked so many people, and he asked people that were really convenient, like his students, for example. So there were a lot of statistical and methodological issues with his research, but he was the first one to do something on this scale. He published these massive reports that became overnight bestsellers, and people bought them and gave them to their partners, right? As here, read this, right? You need to know. But it was just one of the first people to really break that ground. And a lot of controversy, right? He lost his career as a professor. He had to choose, right? Back in the 1930s, obviously a very different climate than today. But probably, and I would say he is considered the most influential researcher related to sex of the 20th century. Any comments or thoughts or anything from the little documentary? Any questions, comments, thoughts, anything? All right. I posted the video on Canvas too, if you missed part of it or wanted to watch it later. It is on there. And then two other people, just to mention here, we talked about Masters and Johnson in that little quiz I gave you. They were lovers, right, which is one of you noted, but they were also very famous sex researchers. They married each other and then got divorced 20 years later, interestingly. But they were some of the first people to study the physiology of sexual response. They studied people having sex and saw what happened to the body during sex. Now, again, this was happening during the 1950s, super controversial research, a lot of ethical concerns. They would bring people in, volunteers, and have them have sex, record them on a video camera, and also attach instruments to their body to measure like vasocongestion, blood flow, right, lubrication and arousal, heart rates. And so they came up with the different stages of sexual response that we go through as a result of the research. Again, very controversial, but they were some of the first people to do that. And that went all the way through like the 1970s. A lot of knowledge gained from that research. And then Evelyn Hooker was one of the first people to study the differences between gay men and straight men to try and look at the idea that homosexuality wasn't a mental illness. So all the way up until 1973, if you identified as gay or lesbian or even bisexual, that was considered a mental illness that required treatment. Her research led to that being removed as a mental illness because she found that there wasn't that much of a difference between the two in the way that they were responding. So kind of playing a big role in that. So these people up here are some of the more prominent. There was a really kind of cool show. I was going to say documentary, but it's more of a show called The Masters of Sex that came out a few years ago about Masters and Johnson, just as a side note, if you're interested in learning more. But between these three clusters, we've learned so much. But again, a lot of this research is old, and there's not a lot of people who've taken their place since. So still a lot of room for growth. As I mentioned, there's lots of issues, not only with what Kinsey faced, but also just in sex research and research in general. Research is tricky, right? I also teach research methods online, right? There's a lot of things that you have to take into account when you're conducting any kind of research. Some ethical issues, some sampling problems, and then there's just kind of like logistical issues that we can face as well. Some ethical issues is you have to give informed consent whenever you're conducting research. And so let's say I wanted all of you to engage in like a research study. I would have to tell you what I'm planning to do, what I would like to know, and get your consent or agreement to participate. Right, this is like a very basic thing that you have to have from any participant before you begin research. You have to let them know like roughly what you're going to do. You don't have to tell them everything. You can trick them a little bit as long as you debrief and reveal it later. But you have to get consent from the people that you're doing research with. You also have to maintain confidentiality. So if you give me information, I can't share that, at least not in a way that it would identify. So if I got some general statistics from this class, I could share the statistics, but I couldn't be like, you admitted this and you admitted that, right? Like I have to keep it very confidential, right? And so that's something that you have to keep in mind whenever you're conducting any kind of research. Now, the issues we run into a ton when it comes to human sexuality research is something called a volunteer bias. Now, when I told you that Masters and Johnson had people videotaped and recorded, some of the looks on your face were like, I would never do that, right? Like, and I won't ask you to admit that, but just be thinking in your mind, would you be willing to do something? Couple of you let us know, right? Would you be willing to be videotaped, watched, and recorded having sex? And what kind of person is willing to do that? Is there maybe something different about somebody who's willing to volunteer for that than like the average person? We get this issue called a volunteer bias. What if there's something about the people who volunteer that makes them different from people who wouldn't, right? So we run into this problem in classes, but a lot of people in psychology will be like, oh, I have this beautiful population. I can use all of you as my research subjects. But there's issues with that, right? You might not have the ability to say no. You might feel like you can't say no because you're in this class and you don't want me to be upset with you or something like that. And it's not a random sample. That's huge when it comes to statistics. And Kinsey was super guilty of this. He took what's called a sample of convenience, the people who were convenient to him. And that led to what we could say is a volunteer bias or like biased research. If, for example, let's say that I wanted to know about the sexual behavior of women, right? Like I'm interested in the average sexual behavior of women, how often they have sex, how many partners they have, how often they reach orgasm, and so on. And I only ask prostitutes. Do you think my research is going to be like generalizable to everybody? Maybe, but probably not, right? So when you're doing research, you want to have what's called a random sample. Like as part of my study on women's sexuality, I would want to ask people who are prostitutes or sex workers, right? But I would also want to ask people who are celibate, people who are single versus married versus in a relationship, people who are older, younger, religious, not religious. I want to get a little bit of everybody. If you don't, then the answers that you get aren't necessarily like generalizable to everybody. And so that's something that Kinsey ran into. That's something we see a lot with sexuality research. A lot of people aren't comfortable giving their responses, or maybe it's changed by who's around them, or how you ask them, or who asks them. Would it change for you if a man asked you versus a woman asked you versus somebody who's maybe non-binary, right? Would it change for you? And so that's something that we see be a big like sampling issue. We also see issues with accuracy and consistency, reliability and validity. Do people tell you the truth, right? And that's something that you see a lot with human sexuality research. People sometimes lie, or they don't know the answer. Maybe you ask somebody, what's your gender identity? And they don't know what that means. Or what's your orientation? And they're not sure, right? And so we run into these issues of like accuracy, and consistency, and volunteer bias, and honesty when we're trying to do this kind of research, especially sex research. It makes a lot of people uncomfortable. A lot of people don't want to share those details. And so Kinsey got some wonderful information, but it's been heavily criticized for his like methodological stuff that he did. And you're going to have an opportunity to kind of see a little bit of this, just on like a small scale. What I want to do for a little bit here is I'm going to have you get into groups, and I'm going to have you start thinking about if you were to conduct a little bit of sex research, what would you want to know? Okay, so I have a slide here for this. This is going to be our second participation exercise. So I'm going to have you get into groups of like 3 to 5 people. I don't want it to be any bigger or smaller than like 3 to 5. So 3, 4, or 5 people, whatever's convenient and easy around you. You're going to need a piece of paper, right? Write all of your names on it, first and last, so because you're going to be turning in eventually. And what I want you to do with the group, and I'm going to give you like 15 minutes to do this, is I want you to come up with 2 possible topics that you would want to research if you could conduct research. Now think about more like a survey kind of research. Like if you were to go ask questions, like what would you want to know? Like I gave you the example of what are the average like sexual behaviors of women? You could be, how often do people masturbate? How often do you fantasize, right? Like think about 2 specific like topics or questions that you would want to research and write them down. What would you need to ask in order to get that information? Right, so if I wanted to know the average sexual behaviors of women, what questions would help me to answer, right, if I were to ask them to me? And then what kind of demographic information would you want to collect? Would you want to know someone's age, if they were in a relationship or not, if they were religious or not, right? Like what would you want to know about them that might be interesting, that might kind of change the results? Because maybe sexual behavior of women is influenced by whether they're in a relationship or they're religious or their gender identity or their orientation or whatever. What would you want to know? So I'm going to give you, as I said, about like 15 minutes. I'll wander around, but try and get some thoughts down, right? Come up with 2 specific topics. What questions would you need to ask? And then what kind of demographic information would you want to have? So find some people like 3 to 5. Have somebody write it down. Go ahead, get started, and I'll wander around. And if you have any questions or thoughts. For a minute or 15, run out of time. So I have a couple of people ask this, but I'm just going to reveal this little piece of information to you here. You are going to be conducting this research next class here on campus with other Moorpark College students, right? I don't know if that makes you excited or terrified, maybe a little bit better. Something to look forward to or dread, right? That's you feel. So let me give you a little bit of information, a little bit more, and then I'll take attendance before. So next class, what we're going to do is I'm going to have you get back into your groups and do just a tiny bit of planning. We'll go over some ground rules, some places that you're going to go. We do have some ground rules for you that we'll talk about. I've done this a few times. It tends to be interesting. And I think you all have some really fun questions. Like, I'm excited to see what people say, right? And so what we'll do is I'll have you get back into groups. And just to give you a little bit of like an anxiety reducer, if you're terrified about the thought of asking people, not everyone in your group has to ask questions. Okay, so you're gonna be going out as groups, but the nice thing, because some of you have a little bit larger groups, you could have one person ask and somebody else take notes. You can have somebody stand back and kind of observe the whole thing, because that's interesting too, right? The dynamics of how you ask and who asks and how many people ask can actually really change the results too. So what I want you to do between now and next class is just be thinking about it. You don't need to do anything, but just kind of think about it in the back of your mind. We'll take a few minutes. I'll let you have one more chance with your group. If you know you're not going to be here next time, maybe make sure somebody who is going to be here has that piece of paper so that that doesn't cause anxiety, or you can take a picture of it if you want to have it in your mind, that's fine. But we'll go out onto campus. We'll spend maybe like 20 minutes or so out there asking people questions, and then we'll come back here and we'll talk about it together. This tends to be interesting. Now, it's gotten me in trouble once or twice, but I'm okay with that. I'm a little bit of a rebel. Plan for next class, and then we'll wrap up like chapter 2 and move on. I hope you're excited about that. I'm excited about it. Yeah. Well, let's get it down to I want to hear. What was that?
Like me asking about
Yeah, so I had you come up with 2 questions, right? Most of you, I kind of went around to every group. Most of you narrowed it down to 1, but yeah, you're going to be doing one of them. Sometimes you could combine them. A couple of people kind of did that. But one of them, the one that you feel best with. So between, give me like 1 more minute. I'm glad you're excited. It makes me happy. Between now and next class, just think about it. Is there anything else that you feel like you need to know? Are there any definitions that are unclear? If you're asking about things like gender, orientation, cheating, right? Like if you're asking about those things, how are you defining them? Because you're gonna run into that. So just be thinking about it. And that'll be what we do next time on Monday. When it's nice and hot, right? We'll go outside and do that. So let me take attendance.